Today on the Andrew Cooperrider Show, a story dropped last night that I think is incredibly important, and I think we need to take a moment on the national politics stage to really go over, as I have a little bit of a unique experience specifically with what happened after 2016, just due to my experience with marketing and business and how that shifted how we behaved online. And it looks like, based upon a story that dropped last night, that we're going to have even more concern about censorship, even more concern about the government and social media companies and Google and tech companies shutting down speech they don't actually agree with. We'll go over exactly what that story is. And then also Kenton County Schools, those of you who listen to the show on a regular basis know that I covered a story last week or so regarding Kenton County sending out a letter to first graders asking them to be able to discuss with them about things like sexual gender orientation, sexual orientations in general, about their gender identity, all that kind of crazy leftist garbage. On top of that leftist garbage, but talking about clearly very adult topics, but with children, the school, Kenton County Schools, has apologized and sent a reply. We'll go over exactly what they had to say. We'll have all that and more today on the Andrew Cooperrider Show. As always, please make sure you like, comment, share, and subscribe. Make sure you're telling others about the show as well. We do see some growth going on with listenership, and we want to make sure we continue that. So please tell others to make sure they're tuning in each and every day to the Andrew Cooperrider Show. And for those of you who just started tuning in, you can go back and listen to old episodes as well. Please do so. There's some interesting ones down in there. But without further ado, let's dig down into it. So an indictment dropped last night, or yesterday technically, regarding a Russia-based media company. Two employees were indicted by the U.S., and then also there was a lot of internet domains seized. Now, a part of that indictment, it mentioned another company, which was confirmed by the media to be the company called Tenet Media. And essentially this company, this RT company, gave Tenet Media, was funneling Tenet Media around $10 million in order to help promote their shows. And Tenet Media, some of their big names they had of podcasts and shows that they were pushing out: Tim Pool, Benny Johnson, The Rubin Report, several of these right-wing big media accounts. I mean, Tim Pool has millions of followers on Twitter and Facebook and, of course, YouTube, and has a very popular podcasts that come out each and every day, several times a day. And so they were, apparently Tenet Media signed a deal with these podcasters where essentially they got distribution rights to their podcasts, and then Tenet Media would make the money off the distribution rights. And then this Russian media company gave Tenet Media $10 million to promote those shows. And so what they're claiming is that there's a lot of lines being drawn to say ipso facto, Tim Pool, Benny Johnson, Dave Rubin, they're Russian agents. That's the current story going on. And for those of you who have no clue who any of these people are, I'm just telling you, they are bigger, quote unquote, right-wing podcasts. And it's hard to say right-wing because, of course, Tim Pool, he isn't exactly very right-wing. He was a professional skateboarder. He was a reporter for Vox. Really, he's kind of stayed put. What's happened is that the middle and the left has shifted so far left that it pushed him now, where by definition he becomes right-wing. But this is the kind of guy that I think he's very Bernie bro type, would be my best way to describe it, that, just has this general thought process. And then rather than getting caught up in Team Red versus Team Blue, he's kind of just stayed out of it. And what it's led to is where he now gets defined as right-wing. So you have this story dropping involving these podcasters. And now, granted, the story in and of itself and the indictment in and of itself is simply that a Russian media group gave money to another company who then spent that money promoting the Tim Pool or Dave Rubin or Benny Johnson podcast. It's not saying that those podcasts themselves were in direct contact with Russian agents. They weren't being paid off by Russian agents. That's not what's being alleged here. And so if I had to sum this up, basically what has occurred is that these three people have one thing in common, and that is that they are against America funding the war in Ukraine. Now, anybody who works in politics at all will tell you that there are times, not times per se, but there are plenty of individuals that all they care about is your messaging on certain items. You know, they care about the fact that, oh, okay, you're against the war in Ukraine and funding the war in Ukraine, so we will promote your podcast. We want more people to hear your viewpoint because we want the American people to put pressure on the government to stop funding Ukraine. Now, this is not all that different. I mean, obviously this is playing out in the media realm, but this isn't all that different than like during the Cold War, for an example, where America would give money and guns and a whole bunch of other things to specifically the Taliban in Afghanistan because they were fighting the Russians. But keep in mind what ended up happening in that position was those same people that America said, you know, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And in this case, Russia was looking, I believe, at the one aspect of funding the Ukraine war and saying the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And so we're going to fund them. We're going to try to push their show out there more through these back channels without them even knowing. And so in the same way, obviously America funded and pushed up the Taliban. But then what ended up happening? Well, the Taliban turned around and attacked America. They came after Americans. And in the same way and of the same concern, you would see something similar playing out with these podcasters because their belief in saying, look, I don't believe in this Ukraine war funding has to do with the fact that, you know, it's dumping billions of dollars. What exactly are we benefiting from? War's bad. Specifically, Tim Pool is a war reporter for Vox. Tim Pool's been in many war zones and, places where there's rebellions going on and those kinds of things. So obviously he's very war shy. And so those are just their opinions, and just that one opinion Russia likes. Now, granted, there's other opinions Russia doesn't like. For example, you have a CNN headline from a little while ago, from just about 7-8 months ago, where they said that Russia wants Biden to win the election, not Trump. For obvious reasons, of course, because Biden's a very weak president, he's a very weak leader, and that makes it easier on Russia. So they weren't promoting these right-wing podcasters because they liked that they were pushing Trump, because they don't want Trump in the presidency. That's what they've said. Now, what they're saying is that they're pushing these right-wing podcasters simply because they're anti the Ukraine war. And it's very likely these right-wing, quote-unquote right-wing podcasters have no idea what's going on. They were not party to the decisions. They are out of the loop. All they were doing was making their show like they always made it. In fact, Tim Pool put out a statement stating that he is Tenet Media never had any control over what was being said or done on the show. In fact, when you listen to the show and you listen to how they set it up and who they talk to and how they talk to them, there's not really a good way to program it because it's just like an open conversation format show, generally speaking. And so it's kind of hard to deal with it. And the people that he's having on are people that are well known in conservative media and middle and central media. It's not like they're like these crazy, he'll sometimes have on crazy people, but mainly just to make fun of them. But they're not these crazy right-wing people, because Tim Pool, in this case, isn't crazy or right-wing. So I bring that up. So that's all an interesting story, to say the least. Obviously, people are reading too much into it on the left side of things because, of course, it plays to their narrative. But what is that narrative? And this is where I think we're in a very dangerous time right now, because I remember 2016, and I don't know if you do, but I do. And in 2016, we had a similar storyline. You know, the season, America season 2024 is a lot like America season 2016, just with everything's a little bit more intense, right? Because Russia was what everybody was yelling out there when Trump was running for office in 2016. Now, I will say politically, the claims of trying to attack Trump and attack Trump allies due to this Russia connection, I think it's not going to work very well, because the American people, keep in mind, the majority of voters right now are either left or right. They're either going to vote for Kamala Harris no matter what, or they're going to vote for Trump no matter what. That's it. There's a small percentage, 5 to 10% of voters. And really, those 5 to 10% of voters in certain states like Wisconsin, like Michigan, like Pennsylvania, like Arizona, like Nevada, like North Carolina, like Georgia, that matter the most. Those are the people they're messaging to. They're not messaging to 90% of even the people within that state. They're messaging only to those swing voters. And then they're running on their side, get out the vote campaigns for the people they know are going to vote for them anyways, to make sure that they do get out and vote. But putting that to the side, those people, those middle 10% or so people, they're probably not going to be very swayed by this kind of story. One, it's convoluted. Just as I was explaining it to you exactly what happened, you probably had a hard time understanding exactly how it was all attached, and then turning around and tying that to Donald Trump gets a little more convoluted. If you're very online, if you're very on the Twitters or you're very on the Facebooks, and you're just you know who these people are already, it might be easier for you to understand. But if you don't, you have no clue anything about what's going on. But this is my real concern about this story. I don't think it has as much to do with the presidential election as it does with the censorship regime. Because in 2016, specifically after Donald Trump won, but leading up to that, we heard a lot of claims of Russia, which is why, by the way, the independents, on top of being convoluted, I don't think care much about the story, because they've heard this before. They've heard the Trump, Russia hoax. And they've seen it play out over 3-4 years, and they saw it become nothing. In fact, what instead ended up happening is that people who perpetrated that initial push towards this Russia disinformation campaign reportedly being a thing ended up themselves getting called out for making these things up. And so the American people have seen that. So I don't think they get won over to one side or the other based on the story. But after the Russia hoax leading up to the election and Donald Trump won, social media became a completely different world. Google became a completely different world. For advertising, anybody who did advertising at that time knows there was a real shift. Now for like Facebook ads and Google ads, a lot of times you have to verify your identity. They get very picky about things that are political or not. For an example, this podcast, take this show that I do. Legally speaking, if I ran an ad for this podcast, it is not a political ad, because I am not advocating for the election or defeat of one person or another. I'm not advocating on an issue. I'm not advocating on any of that. But what Google and Facebook and social media places started requiring was that if anything even was slightly political and you wanted to run an ad, well, you had to verify your identity first. And it wasn't just upload a picture of your ID. No, you had to upload a picture of your ID. You had to go get a document signed and notarized and get that approved. And then you had to set up political disclaimers. So even ads that aren't political in nature, such as advertising, for example, this podcast, I have to go verify my identity. I have to get a document signed and notarized. Then I have to create a paid for by disclaimer. If I don't do those things and I try to run the ad, Facebook will say, no, you have to do those things or because this is political at all in nature. Google, much the same way. You started to want to run Google ads. You had to verify your identity, go through that rigmarole, create a disclosure, and then they keep a record of who's buying what that's available to the public. And they do that regardless of if they think it's super duper political or not. If their automated system detects that it's political, they will make those requirements. So that's just one way that it was affected greatly. But also when we take a look at the algorithms, Facebook, Google, Twitter at the time started shutting down accounts that they believed were quote unquote Russian bots, because they just believe that they're Russian bots. And a lot of people who have real accounts get caught up within that fray. Also, they changed around their algorithms and they stopped pushing out right-wing content. Recently, we've seen, of course, on Twitter and other places, this videos regarding Alexa, where if you ask Alexa, why should I vote for Donald Trump or why should I vote Kamala Harris, you get obviously very tinged things. We've seen this with the AI models, asking them political questions about both Trump and Kamala Harris. You'll get two totally different answers, or Trump and Biden. You'll get different answers. Google now. Go Google Donald Trump and then Google Kamala Harris. If I Google Donald Trump right now, the top stories I get is 5 takeaways from Donald Trump's town hall. Donald Trump, we are heading into World War III territory. Trump takes shots at Harris's personality and policies at friendly Pennsylvania town hall. Donald Trump has lost $14 billion in wealth. Or sorry, not 14. Donald Trump has lost $4 billion in wealth amid bumpy ride for Trump media. That's the top stories. Now, if I Google Kamala Harris as the top stories right now, what I see is Liz Cheney says she's voting for Harris for president. Republican Liz Cheney says she'll vote for Kamala Harris. Liz Cheney endorses Kamala Harris. Trump and Harris agree to rules for ABC campaign. Polling, Nostradamus calls election for Kamala Harris. Those are the top stories. So we look at the Trump top stories were about him losing money, him being mean to Kamala Harris, and then we look at Kamala Harris's top stories, and they're all about how Liz Cheney endorsed her, and that the polling Nostradamus is saying that Kamala Harris is going to win the election. That's the top stories. And so you see that that's how Google changes its algorithms to affect the outcome of campaigns. And they're okay for that came from and dates back to 2016, where, they saw this Russia disinformation. Because before then, they believed in free speech. Well, not completely in free speech, but they're largely pushers of free speech. They largely stayed out of these things. And then when they saw somebody like Trump win, that wasn't supposed to win, everybody turned to them and said, well, it's your fault. They used your tools and your systems and your websites in order to reach people, in order to change the opinion of the American public. So you need to shut that down. They're lying and being mean about it. And so my concern is, and if we go back to 2019, actually, Kamala Harris said this in 2019. Take a listen.
He has lost his privileges and it should be taken down. And the bottom line is that you can't say that you have one rule for Facebook and you have a different rule for Twitter. The same rule has to apply, which is that there has to be a responsibility that is placed on these social media sites to understand their power. They are directly speaking to millions and millions of people without any level of oversight or regulation. And that has to stop.
So my concern, especially after hearing that, mixed with this Russia story that just comes out, mixed with what we saw in 2016, is that they will use this as an opportunity for more censorship. They will use this as an opportunity to break down even more. They will use this. They've already very upset with Elon Musk for not kowtowing and falling in line with everybody else. They're very upset about that. They want to shut that down. I mean, you heard her say it. They don't want you being able to talk to millions of people without oversight, without regulation. They want to be able to say what is true or not. We also are seeing this out of course, the UK, where they're starting to arrest people for quote-unquote inciting violence when they say the wrong things on social media, even things that aren't violent at all because they deem them as too racist. And now we're seeing in New York State that the governor there has committed more state troopers to working on these campaigns, social media campaigns, and identifying people who are fomenting hate, and they labeled it as anti-Semitism and Islamophobia due to a quote-unquote rise in those crimes. Of course, there's not really much of a rise of Islamophobia, but the rise of anti-Semitism, if you want to talk in New York, the state of New York, when we look at the data there, we can see that there's one specific race that is doing these things, but that race is, of course, a minority, and so we don't want to talk about that, and we don't want to dig into that issue too much. So instead, what we're going to do is put together a task force and put more state troopers onto these task force of scrolling Facebook, of scrolling Twitter, and looking for those who say things that they deem to be too racist, and then go after legally. This is a very testy time, and with that story dropping yesterday, of course, the timing is not by accident, I think, and it will be all the excuse that they need in order to, because you got to think, around half, 40 to 50% of the American people at least are so tied into mainstream media. Kamala Harris can do no wrong. We love the Democrats, everything else. I mean, just rewind to COVID. And when they were told, hey, you should be afraid and scared, they were willing to turn in their neighbors for gathering in too many neighbors. They're willing to turn in their local small business owners for not following the mandates. Look at what happened. And so these same propagandists will use these types of stories to push this idea that we need to shut down free speech even more so. And the number one way to guarantee that you can shift the culture, the number one way to guarantee that things are forever changed, the number one way to guarantee that you can actually call people that are against things like gender craziness and everything else weird is by shifting the culture through the media sources, through social media especially, and controlling who can say and do the things they want you to say or do. It's this last month has been a very scary time for those who can see how important it is that free-flowing, free speech, free information, that people are able to communicate with one another in order to exchange ideas, debate ideas, how important that is to establishing a good world and a free world. This last month has been very dangerous. You got UK, you got New York, of course you have what's going on in Brazil, you've got the Telegram founder getting arrested in France. You know how this story coming out about Russia. It's a very troubling time. Speaking of troubling things, those of you who listen to the show know about a week or so ago, I covered a story regarding a form that Kenton County Schools here in Kentucky had sent home to a first grader. And it was about a parent/guardian consent for certain mental health topics. And in the document, they asked permission to talk to their children or a mental health provider or a child or somebody from the school to talk to their child about sexual orientation, gender identity, and or gender expression. And of course, this caused a lot of outrage. I mean, we're talking about first graders here sending home these forms. Absolutely ridiculous. Well, the school has responded, and here's what they came out with. So this is from Link NKY's article. It says Kenton County Schools has apologized after inadvertently, so of course it was by accident, right? They're like, yeah, we accidentally sent home a letter asking a parent of a first grader if we could go ahead and talk to them about, banging other dudes. We accidentally sent home a letter to a first grader asking the parents to make sure, it was okay that we go ahead and talk to them about, chopping their body parts off and taking gender hormones and cross-dressing. Is that okay? Can we do that? That was an accident. We didn't mean to send that home, surely. Now, if they can accidentally, think about this for a second. If the school can, quote-unquote, accidentally, inadvertently, send home 63 letters to people that didn't need them about a topic that would cause so much backlash, obviously, and some of those being first grade students. Think about what else they can inadvertently do. It makes you wonder about the competence of who's running those schools over there, doesn't it? Certainly leaves a lot of questions to be asked. But they defended sending the letter home. They said, we didn't mean to send that home. It was meant to send home. So returning to the article, Kenton County School Superintendent Henry Webb said in a press statement Monday that the letter was sent inadvertently to these students. It was intended only for families of students who had previously disclosed information regarding gender or sexual orientation with school personnel. The letter that was sent was developed specifically for families that have students who've disclosed information to an adult in the school setting regarding gender orientation, identity, and or expression. This letter is in compliance with Senate Bill 150 of the 2023 legislative session that ensures that a school does not discuss these topics with a child that discloses this information without parental consent. SB 150 requires parental consent for schools to discuss human sexuality-related health topics with students and to refer students for health or mental health services out of school setting with notification required for in-school with referrals. So rewind there for a second. So the claim here is that they sent this home inadvertently because they normally only send this home to students who've basically come out at the school saying they're gay or saying they think they're experiencing different genders. And then they go ahead and they ask the parent, hey, can we get consent for talking to your kids about these issues? And can we get consent for sending them to a mental health provider out of the school system? But there's another line in here where it talks about just simply letting you know with just notification required for in-school referrals. And this goes back to an overall conversation that we've had on this show time and time again about the school's role in so-called mental health side of things. Time and time again, we see that these public schools are believing that it is their role to get involved in the mental health side of things. Never mind the fact they can't teach math. Never mind the fact they can't teach reading. Never mind the fact that, they're not doing their basic job of, teaching the kids well. But no, instead they've decided that it's their job, their responsibility to go ahead and spend time discussing about mental health issues with kids. And by the way, as long as the person works for the schools, well, they don't have to let you know anything about it. They have to let you know, but you don't need to consent. We just had to let you know that they're talking to a mental health provider. And for those of you who think, well, that can't be that scary, I ask you and I bring up Anderson County Schools again, where there's a situation regarding a girl who I believe was 16 years old at the time, 17 years old, 16 I believe, at the time, whose parents found out that she was seeing another girl. And they didn't even know that their child had any kind of gay inclinations or anything. And when they found it out, they were very upset. Not as much because the child was gay, though they are Christians and that goes against their faith and that's something to work through, and obviously it could be just a phase, but more so because in the same way that if you had a young girl or a young guy who were spending time with somebody of the opposite sex, engaging in that kind of behaviors, you wouldn't be letting them spend the night together and everything else. And so what they were upset about was, okay, so you're seeing this girl, you're getting involved with this girl, but also you've been like spending the night with this girl without telling us what was going on. We have big issues with that. So they grounded her. They said, you can't see her anymore because you didn't follow our rules when it comes to this person. You need to stay away from them. You're grounded from dating completely, basically, because you were not honest and straightforward. So regardless of how you feel, if you want to make the claim that we should be treating gay relationships exactly the same as straight relationships, which even those who really push this entire idea of these things into schools and they talk about all these things, they're not looking for equal treatment. If they were, they wouldn't be having parades celebrating their sexualities. They wouldn't be having parades talking about how gay they are. They wouldn't be doing those types of things. No, instead, they would be doing exactly what straight people are doing, of not talking all the time and making it a part of their quote-unquote identity who they go to bed with. And in the same way that in a straight relationship between underage children, the parent gets involved in making sure that they're not spending the nights together. So if it was a gay relationship, it'd be the same rules. Well, the guidance counselor at Anderson County Schools had a big problem with that. And so she facilitated letting those two girls continue to see each other in her office. She would give them alone time in her office to spend time together because she believed that was her role. Now, a notification of, oh, hey, your child's talking to the mental health expert. In fact, the parent of the daughter who was talking about this situation that happened with the Anderson County Schools talked about how they were aware that she was seeing the guidance counselor, but they're not aware about what the guidance counselor is talking to them about. Which is why, once again, I think that this is a horrible decision. Because the school just letting, and it's a horrible decision on our Republican legislators. But they're so on this train as well. Keep in mind that in the Guardian bill that came out this past year, in this Republican bill, they also put together a trauma response team with mental health providers being put together in order to provide resources and responses to mental health trauma. That's the Republicans doing that. And what we really need to be saying is we need to keep the schools away from this. They're not the child's parent. When it comes to mental health issues, you need to be very careful about who's talking to your kid. Because you never know what they're putting in their mind. You never know where their viewpoint's coming from. You never know what their worldview is. So if you decide you want a mental health professional talking to your child, you need to vet that person deeply. And a simple notification home isn't enough. It is not the school's place at all, in my opinion. The school is there to teach them. And for those of you who say, well, but if the schools don't do it, who's going to? These kids are going to end up mentally unwell and killing themselves. Let me ask you this. Child suicide rate, according to the WHO in America, since 2003, has almost doubled. Now, do you think they were spending more time or less time in 2003 talking to kids about their mental health? More time or less time? What do you think? Well, based on how much we talk about now, how much more funding we put into it, how much more we pass laws about it, based on all those things, you would definitely say that they're spending more time on it now than they were before. And yet our results are children are killing themselves at twice the rate. It isn't working. And I so wish Republicans could recognize this, but this is another one. Those of you who listened to the show yesterday know I talked about Republicans, especially in the establishment, being gun shy about literally any issue at all. And I'd love for them to come out and say, guys, this is ridiculous. We're spending gobs of money. The kids aren't getting better. Let's just worry about schools being schools. And then if a person needs to worry about mental health services, we'll do that elsewhere. And a parent can make that decision about their child. Schools don't need to be involved in it at all. Well, y'all, that's all I got time for today on the Andrew Cooperrider Show. We'll see you back here tomorrow. I hope you have a great rest of your day.